In Maryland, Montgomery County Public Schools made space for police officers in every high school, a move that is intended to bolster the relationship with police at schools. But not everyone is convinced that the so-called community engagement officers will make schools any safer. Here's what Montgomery Council member Will Jawando said.
So this idea that a police officer in a school equals safety is at best unproven. There's data actually suggesting the opposite. But start with what we do know. We know what works, the investments that we're doing. We know what hasn't been working in Montgomery County and across the country as far as disproportionality in arrests. Those are the things we know.
Joining us now to talk in depth about alternative solutions to having police officers in schools is Councilmember Will Jawando and Newsweek contributor Denise Long. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Good morning.
So, Will, for those who aren't aware, what are the facts about what happens when you have police officers in school?
Well, Montgomery County, Maryland, diverse jurisdiction of 1 million plus people, we're no different from most of the country, where you see high disproportionality in who is arrested and engaged and entered into the criminal justice system by police officers in schools. Black students, for example, make up about 19% of our student body population, and we have the 14th largest school district in the country, about 160,000 students, but they accounted over the last 4 years for over 50% of the arrests. So 19% of the population, 50% of the arrests. If you add Latino students, you get up to 75% of the people who are arrested by police in schools are Black or brown, despite representing much less of that population. Then when you dig into what the arrests are for, disruption, fighting, things that many of us did, low-level drug possession, and things that are happening with all kids. And students with disabilities are also disproportionately arrested. So that's what we know is happening, and you see that across the nation. And we know also, as I mentioned in those comments, that police actually don't prevent mass shooting events in schools. There's a lot of other things that do, and we can get into that, but I think it's important to note we all want our kids safe. I have 4 children in the system. The last thing I want is them to be in harm's way. It's the question of how to produce that safety, and there are much better ways to do it. Social workers, counselors, investments in wraparound services. Those are the things that are really going to keep kids safe and reduce interpersonal conflict, which is really the starting point of a lot of this.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of agreement during this segment. I agree with everything you just said. I did a lot of reporting a few years back on police in schools, and I was interested in when it started, and it looked to me like, from doing the research, that going back to the 1970s, you would have not found a police officer in any school in America. Mm-hmm. And now, today, something like half of all public high schools have a police officer. And what my major concern is that, and it's just as you said, Will, that disciplinary issues that ought to be handled by and would have been handled by counselors, teachers, parents, principals now become criminal justice matters. And the earlier you start involving people in the criminal justice system, the worse their social outcomes, professional outcome, everything is going to be for them. What are your thoughts on this subject, Denise?
Yeah, I have to agree with you and with Will about kind of the impact of disparate discipline on youth. And we've known this about Black students for quite some time, right? Children's Defense Fund was one of the first to report about the disproportionate treatment of Black students. I believe that research came out in 1975. They also showed that Black students were more likely to be referred to special ed. So there's this trifecta. It is being Black, it is being of low socioeconomic status, and also having a disability. To your point, Robbie, about what makes students safe. So there was some research that came out and was published in March of 2022. And what the research did is looked at this very issue. They took a look at what students' perceptions of safety, as well as students' perception of police impartiality and being just when they have law enforcement in their school. And this is what they found. They found that middle school and at the high school level, the only way the students had a positive perception of police after police police were in their schools? What is if police operated at 3 levels, not just the law enforcement, you're breaking the rules level? That always correlated with a negative perception of police being just. They only had a just perception if police did teaching, if they also did coaching, if they had other truly relationship building, truly giving relationships with youth in schools. So it very much depends on how police, whatever you call them, student resource officers, engagement officers, whatever, how they show up in the school environment with the student.
Yeah, it seems pretty incredible to think you're going to increase trust between kids and police officers by having them stake out the hallways, as though kids are already saying, oh, I love school, I love teachers, I don't have a problem with authority. I'm going to love this more authoritarian figure who doesn't even have the relationship in the classroom with me that my teacher hopefully does. I'm curious why, let me ask you this, Denise, why you think there is this kind of ideological commitment, it seems, among some people, and not just on the right, to the idea that the answer to this problem is more police officers?
Well, when you look at the research about this issue, what you commonly see is the researchers cite this 1990s rise of zero tolerance policies. You saw that both in terms of the national legislation about, drug use. You saw this in California with three strikes rules. So we've carried forth this sort of almost 50-year-old way of operating when there's so much social science, psychological science that really does teach us what we have done that have caused the issues that we're talking about, as well as what we can do to actually support the psychological safety and the physical safety of students. So there are ways that I think education needs to evolve and actually utilize the best practices and the research that we have if we are going to have any law enforcement in schools, because there's a threat to actual physical safety. What we do know is the best practice for training law enforcement officers to engage with folks with mental health concerns, and many of our youth have significant psychological trauma for various reasons that we can talk about. But the crisis intervention teams, the CIT training for law enforcement officers, if any officer carrying a gun is going to be in a school, they absolutely need to have that kind of training to understand how to deal with our youth.
Yeah, that's so key, the zero tolerance policies you mentioned. I think a lot of people are familiar with maybe like the most egregious cases, the kid who famously chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun and was like expelled for having a look-alike weapon. But there are so many, there are tons of examples of these, some of them not as crazy as that one, but just forget it, leaving your airsoft rifle or your paint gun in your car when you park at the school. And then I think most people think that person should get like detention, but what happens is they're going to get expelled, and then if there's a police officer in the school, they might also get arrested and expelled and charged. And it's a total lack of proportionality. Will, you mentioned, when I was in school, when you were in school, kids were allowed to screw up and be punished in proportion to their failing, and then to learn from that mistake and then grow as young people and move past it. And we're just, with police in schools, with zero tolerance, also with the kind of social media requirements on kids, the things they post on Twitter or where they're actually involved, Snapchat or TikTok or whatever, are going to last forever and are going to get them in trouble later. I'm not sure there are necessarily policies to address this, but certainly socially, I think we're becoming very unforgiving of young people or of expecting of them things that are totally unreasonable and were not expected of any generation prior to this one.
It's a good point. I mean, it's one of the reasons when I first introduced the bill to remove police officers from schools, because they had been in schools for 20 years, and then we removed them for about 6 months. And now we had a horrible shooting. 2 students got in a conflict, and 1 student shot another in a bathroom. Thankfully, both the student is alive. And that was caused this kind of snapback. But we introduced 3 special appropriations, one for restorative justice training to get all of our 40 middle schools and all the staff in those buildings. That's how, like, when conflict does happen, how do you resolve it in a way that the person who's harmed gets restored, and you talk to the person who did the harm about what they did, and they understand, and there's there's very processes. And we've expanded that training. We also did therapeutic services and the like. The most frustrating thing about this issue with me is, and I said it earlier this week in the clip that you played, we know what works. We know if our counselors, our kids, they are begging us for mental health supports. And we know if we give them to them, that is going to help them. We know if they give them a trusted adult. And not that a police officer can't be a trusted adult. This is the other part that I think happens with this issue. They can, but their job is to be law enforcement primarily. And if you give them some training, they're not a youth development specialist. And there are better trained adults that can actually reduce interpersonal conflict and help kids. And that's the thing. And I'm all for the programmatic engagement, things like after school basketball, co-teaching, drunk driving seminars, where you reduce and remove the enforcement opportunity, because having good community police relations is a good goal. It's just not the goal in an enforcement capacity in the schools. That's where it's inappropriate. Right,
and it's just so obvious to me that the likelihood of introducing more harm than you would prevent from having police in schools, I mean, it's so obvious. And then, right, what we're talking about, what we imagine is that in the absolute worst case scenario, a mass shooting in a school, which happens actually very rarely, you would want to have a police officer so they could prevent it, but how many cases do we have of that actually happen? Famously, in the Parkland shooting, the school resource officer, he hid. He didn't do anything.
Yeah, I'm curious, Will, what happened in that instance that you just brought up? Is the belief that if there had been an officer there, that the shooting wouldn't have taken place, or that if, after the shooting, that it was required for someone with an officer with a gun to break it up? Because obviously, it did get resolved in some way. Can you give us some clarity there?
Yeah, well, and I think it's one of the schools are a microcosm of our larger society, right? When we see disinvestment in communities that leads to poverty and rise in carjackings or whatever the crime is, we think more police is the answer. And I think, unfortunately, that bleeds over into the school context. In this context, you had two students having, beefing on Instagram, said they were going to meet in the bathroom to fight, something that would have happened after school. One of them brought a DIY gun, which is a huge problem, these ghost guns. One of them brought one of those into the bathroom and shot one kid in the leg area, and the kid actually went back to class, and it was a teacher who came in and removed that kid from class slowly, not an officer. And one of the really important points here is in the study by Hamline University, the JAMA study, 2021, it looked at the last 40 years of police shootings, so 20 years after Columbine, 20 years before. And it shows that when you have an armed police officer in a building where someone is shot or there's a gun brought to school, there's actually more death when the officer is present. And it has an opportunity to escalate the situation. So I think it's counterintuitive in some ways, but I think it's consistent with the culture where we think, okay, crime, we got to, let's stamp it down with police, as opposed to making the investments and supports that are really going to drive crime and interpersonal conflict down.
No, absolutely. Well, we got to go, but I thank you for talking about this. I mean, I have some different ideas or viewpoints on policing issues, but on this, I absolutely agree. There's no evidence in the schools that the police belong there, are doing more good than they are harm. So, Will, Denise, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you. We'll be back with more Rising right after this.